Hi, Jay.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You're Jay Van Bavel. You are a professor of social psychology at NYU, and you are the director of the Social Perception and Evaluation Lab there. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we're going to talk about, on the one hand, your work and some of your ideas about social psychology, but also about contemporary politics, because the two are related.
Yeah, and how can you not talk about politics right now?
That's the other thing, is neither of us has enough self-control to not talk about politics. So even if your work had no bearing, still what we'd be doing. So let me ask you, is it too misleading to say that you study the psychology of tribalism?
No, I think that nails it. That's how I think of a lot of my work.
And what do you mean by that term?
I mean that humans are groupish creatures. We form groups really easily at the flip of a coin. And when we do, it changes our behavior towards others. It changes our patterns of brain activation, our biology, and it has consequences for everything from implicit bias to politics.
By implicit bias, you mean bias that the person is not aware of having?
That's correct, yeah.
And that can be racial bias, but all kinds of other bias.
Yeah, it just means that we have preferences for our own group that stem much deeper than we're aware of.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a perception that right now politics in America is more groupish than usual, or maybe groupish in a different sense than it's been. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I dug up the data on polarization not that long ago and presented it actually on Friday at a conference. And if you look at Senate voting patterns over the past 50 or 60 years, there's far more polarization. People aren't collaborating across parties on bills anymore, certainly not at the rate they used to. And if you just look at the average citizen in the United States, there's far more partisan polarization. And that affects everything from our interactions where we move, who our friends are, to our perceptions of things like the economic state of the country.
And, did you see this op-ed in the Sunday Times about, it was by a former conservative talk show host, and he said, the way to think of the pro-Trumpers is not that they're pro-Trump, they're anti-Trump.
Yeah.
It's because he has the same enemies they have, that they like him.
Yeah, and they take great joy whenever he brings pain or anguish to some liberal. I'll say this, my brother's a huge Trump supporter, and he and I talk politics every day, and there's nothing that brings him greater joy than a sense of schadenfreude when he sees liberals suffering. So.
Huh. Yeah, I have three of my four siblings voted for Trump, but I'm not sure I could manage to talk to them every day about it. That's impressive. How do you to what do you attribute your ability to get along with your brother?
I mean, he's my brother. We've been fighting.
So's mine, but you're going to have to say more before this makes sense to me.
My brothers, I mean, we're comfortable with conflict with one another. We were, there's video, the earliest video I have of us when we're 6 or 8 is fighting with one another in a church. So we're comfortable with conflict and we love each other anyways. And we're both Canadian actually. So neither of us have ever voted.
Oh, well, you kind of saved the punchline. I think you buried the lead here. Yeah. You're Canadians.
So we're comfortable.
I mean, Did you vote? Did you vote in the election?
I'm not, I can't. I'm not an American citizen.
Well, okay, then it's different.
Yeah. We have a little bit of distance, maybe a healthy amount of distance from the election. So.
Okay, so he's a Canadian for Trump. He should start a Facebook. Canadians for Trump. See how many people he gets. So do you when you just process the day's news about Trump and related matters, do you think you're kind of seeing it differently from the average person? I mean, what kinds of things are occurring to you?
What's occurring to me, and I think it's, to me, the biggest issue in American politics right now is partisanship. To go back to your earliest question about the tribal mind or the tribal brain, you're seeing that very few Republicans are coming out against Trump. No matter what he does, he's able to hold his base. So you can see how the average American feels about when he fires the CIA or FBI director or leaks intelligence information. Whenever there's a poll on this, even if 60% of the country's against him, it seems like 85, 90% of Republicans support almost everything he does. And so what you're seeing is massive partisanship, and that's how he's holding his support around 40%, is it's just almost entirely now Republicans.
Yeah, and the point that this guy made in this New York Times op-ed I was talking about was these people really don't agree, or many of them really don't agree with Trump on many of the issues. That's why he says what they are is anti-Trump. It's that they don't like the same people he doesn't like.
Yeah.
Now, do you think, in light of and is that your sense of a lot of the dynamic, that they define their allegiance to him in terms of their common enemy?
Yeah, I think it is. And we know that that's part of identity. Psychologists would call that negational identity, where you really just dislike an out-group and that pushes you towards liking some in-group. Mm-hmm. And that's partly how we define who we are, is who we're against.
Now, do you think this is fairly symmetrical, that liberals are in the same frame of mind?
Yeah, I'll say this. If you look at the liberal data, it's almost the exact mirror, or I'll say this Democrat data is almost the exact mirror of Republican data. So for everything that Republicans like, Democrats seem to despise. There's few things where there's cross-partisan consensus. So I usually look towards what the independents think. That's usually the best barometer in my mind of how the country actually feels. So you have 30, 40% of people who are in the middle, and they, when they're against something like the firing of the FBI director, it gives you a kind of a sense of what the pulse, I think, of the average American is.
Mm-hmm. So what are some kind of classics, before we get into your specific work in this area, what are some kind of classics in psychology, classic experiments, classic findings that are relevant to all this?
Yeah, let me say my maybe 3 favorite findings here. The first one is that in 1971, Henri Tajfeld published what I think is maybe the most amazing finding in human psychology, which was that if you basically flip a coin and put people in one of 2 groups, for whatever arbitrary reason based on abstract art preferences or whatever, but you basically flip a coin, people will discriminate in favor of their in-group over the out-group. And these are people they haven't even met and they don't expect to meet in the future. And what they really care about is maximizing the difference between the in-group and the out-group. They don't care about just giving the in-group the maximal amount. What they care is the in-group gets way more than the out-group. And that sounds a lot like that New York Times op-ed, which is really about maximizing the difference between the in-group and the out-group. And that can come from enhancing the in-group or punishing the out-group. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was maybe the most striking finding to me was this famous study in Robbers Cave. It was a summer camp they created with a bunch of 12-year-old boys. And they split them into 2 camps. And they had them compete over, football games, baseball, tug of war.
And they did not know they were in an experiment. This is the kind of experiment you would not be able to do today. This was, I think, back in the 50s or 60s.
In the 50s, yeah. And so these kids despise one another. If you looked at whether or not they had a friend in the other group, almost none of them did. And so it was really showing once you add competition, it was basically the second ingredient. The first ingredient is flipping a coin and creating 2 groups. The second ingredient is adding competition, especially zero-sum competition, where there can only be one winner and there's one loser. That really adds fire or fuel to the flames of intergroup conflict.
Right. So an example, if I recall correctly, in that experiment of something they would do is they would say, we're going to have a picnic. Yeah. And they let one of the 2 groups get there first and eat all the food. So then the other group would show up and the first group had eaten all the food. So they did stuff like that. Yeah. To develop a sense that it was a zero-sum game. Yeah. And they really came to hate each other deeply.
They were sabotaging each other's cabins and crazy stuff like that.
There were fights. But interestingly, they then engineered some non-zero-sum situations, right? Like they claimed that the water pipe coming into the camp had broken down. So that was like a common peril, and they would have to unite to fix it. They did stuff like that. And as I recall, that went a long way toward healing the rift, right?
Yep. And to me, there's always the possibility for that. It's creating a common group identity or having some subordinate goal. And so my favorite example of that in American politics was after 9/11, you saw George Bush's approval ratings shoot up from about 50% to 90% almost overnight. And so people stopped seeing themselves as Republicans and Democrats, and all of a sudden they had a bigger threat, terrorism, and they started to see themselves through the lens of Americans and rallied around their group leader.
Mm-hmm. Of course, that was when terrorism, for the moment, seemed like a huge threat.
Mm-hmm.
A couple thousand people had died in one day. I mean, maybe now the fact that terrorism is, I think, dividing more than uniting. I mean, there's more disagreement about what to do about it and finger pointing about doing the wrong thing than there is agreement, which suggests that maybe it's actually not that big. Maybe we'll know when it's become a really big problem, when people just unite, you know, in the face of the threat or something. But right now, they're not.
Yeah. I mean, this is the issue. The question, I guess, with, for example, Trump supporters is, when is he going to cross a line where Republican support is going to peel away from him? And it's unclear what that condition would be, but eventually there's going to be something where there's a consensus that crosses all partisan boundaries. And that's what would maybe lead to something like impeachment. But until then, it's hard to imagine something like that happening.
I guess, although, you know, if the premise is right that the hardcore base is driven by dislike, if not hatred, of their idea of this, you know, typical liberal, mm-hmm. and such prominent exemplars as Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and so on, then you kind of have to wonder whether any substantive issue could do the trick. I mean, I think the senators in the the Republican senators, a lot of them don't like Trump, but they're looking at that favorability rating. It's been dipping a little, but I think what you said is right. It's hard to imagine, you know, what it would take to get it down to below 35%. And until then, you're not going to, you know, see any of these impeachment scenarios anybody's talking about. So I guess the question is, or a question is, if you look at the base, right, if they are indeed reacting just against liberals, are liberals, or the mainstream media, all the various people they consider the opposition, are they doing things, reacting to Trump in ways that consolidate his support?
Yeah, I think this is what happened, for example, with responses in Berkeley when Ann Coulter was going to speak, and they had to cancel her speech. And what that does is it plays exactly into a narrative of liberals blocking out conservative thought, and suggests that liberals are fragile and all these, and
snowflakes.
And snowflakes, yeah, that one of the reasons why they love Trump, even though from every response that he gives, he seems like the biggest snowflake in the country. But on the other hand, one reason why he was elected, and I think people found him appealing, is that he said unpopular things. He was aggressive. He didn't hold back, and that appeal. And he knocked down and attacked a lot of liberal groups, from the media to the justice system to certain individuals, and a lot of conservative individuals like that he was taking on all these snowflakes and social justice warriors, as my brother likes to call them.
Yeah. They had become the enemy, I guess, and kind of identity politics had become the enemy, in the speech codes or political correctness, whatever you prefer, that surrounds, associated with identity politics, had become a big part of the enemy.
Yeah, no question.
And do you have a theory as to how that happened? I mean, I know you're not a political analyst.
This is where identity is an issue that affects both sides. I mean, obviously, it affects politics, and partisan identities account for the most variance in who you vote for. But, you know, there's identity politics going on the left. One of the most popular New York Times articles of the year was Mark Lilla's article about the challenges and problems with identity politics as a strategy on the left that he wrote after the election. And he's a colleague of mine here right now at the Russell Sage Foundation, and I was having lunch with him, and he just received a barrage of hate mail. And I know from other colleagues that they don't want to have him at lunch or see him at dinners.
Really?
And he's a liberal who wrote this, and he wrote it.
Well, I mean, his reputation, I would say, had not been of kind of a pure liberal. But anyway,
that's true. I mean, he's a provocateur, and He's more centrist than strictly liberal in many ways. But that landed very poorly among many people on the left. I'll say this, I had a PhD student who posted it on his Facebook wall and liked it, and immediately he was attacked by 3 of his friends, and it was a really spirited debate on his wall among liberals about how to deal with identity on the left. It's a challenge.
So this is, in your mind, this itself is a symptom and a sign that things are on the left are as intensely tribal as things on the right.
They're tribal, but in different ways. I mean, the left cares more about minority rights, and especially among historically victimized groups. But identity is a part of human nature, and so identity and the way it motivates us gets attached to whatever identities matter to us. So on the left, those might be around minority groups and their rights and respect for those groups. On the right, it's around different groups. So one of my favorite examples of this is when Trump talks about coal miners and restoring coal jobs. Well, coal is a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of the American economy, and supporting and endorsing coal workers is not going to really affect the economy in any significant way. But what it is that's right-wing identity politics. What he's doing is signaling to every other working class, mostly male, blue-collar individual that what he stands for is those types of jobs. It's not really about coal miners per se. It's, I think, an identity signal to people on the right.
Right. And I mean, part of the identity politics is the idea that white people are getting a raw deal, or at least certain categories of white people.
Yeah, sure.
So is it like, I mean, is it, when Trump does something that is kind of perceived by people in the center and the left as some epic blunder, yeah, there's an outpouring of outrage, right? He disclosed classified material to the Russian foreign minister. And there's outrage in, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC. But if I understand what you're saying right, and then, well, I should say, and then, I do this. I go, well, everyone's outraged. Let's check the Gallup rating and see if it's plunging. Mm. But if what you're saying is right, it should, if anything, work in the opposite way. In other words, when his supporters see that mainstream media and liberals are outraged, to them, that's a feature, not a bug. And that's just about the main signal they're getting, right?
Yeah. So I literally have a bet with my brother from last week after the outrage when Trump fired Comey. He bet me that Trump's approval ratings would go up, and I bet they'd go down. So
you actually were closer to right. They've edged down a little, right?
They've edged down a little, but what I'm saying is, from the right wing, how they see it is that this will only help Trump, and the outrage on the left is going to look like an overreach and just rally and tighten his support around him. And I sent him the news about the leak this morning, and he immediately sent me a right-wing news source. I sent him the Washington Post article. He sends me something from the Daily Caller saying that it's all fake news on the left. And then, of course, literally as we're talking, Trump comes out and tweets and says basically that it's true and he's entitled to do this. And I'm thinking, okay, my brother will retract what he said. No, he didn't retract. He just says, I don't trust the spin on the left-wing news. So even if they got the facts right, it's the spin is a form of fake news that turns him off. And that's only the times he's even willing to read the things I send him, which is like 90% time he'll see it's from the New York Times or whatever, and he'll just be like, I'm not going to read it. It's from the New York Times. Why would I read that?
Well, there is such a thing as spin. I mean, I don't think there's any such thing as a truly objective news source. And it does seem to me that, a lot of the mainstream media has kind of positioned itself, in a sense, against Trump, even in its purportedly straight news coverage. Is that your sense? I
agree completely. There's almost always spin on news. And most news is a mixture of factual reporting and opinion. And it's almost impossible to get away with. So I do understand how a conservative individual would see that spin and it pops out and they find it offensive, and all the articles they read in the Times or the Washington Post or CNN, and they turn away from it. But what they do is in my observation, and the data backs this up, is that they turn to Breitbart. And I've been trying to convince my conservative friends, go to the Wall Street Journal, please, I beg of you. Read the Wall Street Journal where there's stronger journalistic standards for a right-wing news source. And it's hard for me to convince them to do that because they want the conservatives I talk to about this want the comfort of something that is explicitly spun in a right-wing way. And that makes it very challenging because if they're not going to solid right-wing news sources, they're getting a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, and I mean, they think that we're getting a lot of misinformation too.
Well, let me qualify that. We are.
Yeah.
If you're reading the Huffington Post where there aren't strict editorial standards, or if you're sharing on your social media articles from Occupy Democrats and the other 99%, that's very slanted left. It's purely partisan. It's what you would call like a hyper-partisan news source. But I continue to believe there are sources with a right-wing slant that have higher journalistic standards. And so I really object to the false equivalence of the New York Times is bad news. It's not. For the left, it's the best you'll get.
Yeah. I mean, reporters at the Wall Street Journal would resist your characterization of it as right-wing. There's no doubt that the editorial side is right-wing.
Yeah.
But you could make the case that the reportorial side is, closer to straight down the middle.
That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I know this is kind of a hobby horse of mine, and people who listen regularly have already heard it, so forgive me. But, like when the New York Times said in a headline that Trump had lied about something, this was really an issue with me because, I mean, first of all, I guess reporting has changed over the years. And when I was young, I mean, they really worked to play it straight.
Yeah.
A minimum of sensational adjectives, at least in the kind of respected papers, not the tabloids. And something like the assertion that someone is lying, I think back then there would have been an awareness that actually it's very rare that you know for sure that someone consciously set out to deceive and knew that what they were saying is untrue. And I think with Trump, it's especially hard to say.
Yeah.
And I just think I assume that when Trump supporters see the New York Times call him a liar in a headline, that makes it even harder for the New York Times to ever redeem itself in their eyes. Maybe that's a hopeless task anyway. But this reminds me, I hadn't planned to get into this, but what's your theory of Trump's brain? I mean, he's a really unusual person.
Yeah, I mean, he's unusual. So psychologists, as you probably know, aren't allowed to speculate.
Right. Well, you're not allowed to diagnose him.
Yeah, to diagnose him. But I would say it seems to be becoming increasingly obvious, and you even are starting to hear it from Republicans in office, starting to say that they think that maybe something's not well with him. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't drink, so that's not the issue. But
a drink would probably help him.
We elect presidents who are older, and how old's Trump? 70 years old or something?
70.
I used to work in Alzheimer's Research Center as an intern for a year, and there are major issues with dementia that start to set in for many people, not everybody, not most people, but many people as they age. He's clearly under an inordinate amount of stress, and some people handle stress better than others. And when you're sleep deprived and you're under stress, and if there are any even very early emerging mental issues or neurological issues, it's a really devastating cocktail.
Uh-huh. See, here's my theory of Trump, is that actually I mean, there may be some cognitive decline that's recent, but 10 years ago, he was a weird guy.
Yeah.
So and my theory about all this, it's not that I'm qualified or credentialed, but it's not so much that I would assign a particular malady, pathology to him, like narcissistic personality disorder, although I can see making the case. I think what's interesting about him is that in a way, he's just a normal human with all the worst parts of human nature turned up to 11. Right? I mean, seriously, it's like we all have the impulse kind of to brag. I mean, at least we all want to be seen in the best light.
Yeah,
but most of us from an early age get certain kinds of feedback that discourage us from doing it very overtly. There are cultures where there is more in the way of overt bragging, and this varies across any given country with different cultural and demographic areas and so on. So there's that. We all are by nature all kids experiment with lying, and to the extent that you can get away with dishonesty, you do it. But then you kind of learn that, well, there's not that many cases where actually it's a good idea to out and out lie. And not only that, but as you know, the mind assists our lying by sometimes deceiving us as to what the actual case is. We remember things selectively. We have an exaggerated memory of our triumphs and so on. And you can go down the line. It's like we all resent when people say mean things to us, and we want retribution. We want to say the kinds of things Trump says, but most of us have learned for some reason or another, you exercise self-restraint. So I think you could kind of go down the line, and show that really a lot of what he's doing is typically human. It's just that for one reason or another, it hasn't encountered the modifying influences that are part of socialization and maturation for a normal person.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that. I would also say he's been rewarded incredibly well for these personality characteristics over a long period of time. He's a billionaire. People reward his grandiosity, and slapping his name on everything has made him incredibly wealthy, and it helped him get elected. So to the extent that we continue to reward it, it's hard to imagine any of these things decreasing. And I actually feel like voters knew what they were getting into. He didn't hide any of this during the campaign. So he was as advertised. So to me, the more interesting psychology is not Trump's, but his followers and people who support him and what it would take to change their mind. To me, that's psychologically really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk then a little about your work and work in psychology generally. I mean, I gather you've been making the case lately that the kinds of, we call them cognitive biases, a lot of the biases that abet a psychology of tribalism, and also abet, for that matter, a psychology of egoism. They convince us that we as individuals maybe are better than our rivals and stuff like that. But they certainly do play out in a group context and help convince us that our group is more entitled than the other group, and so on. And I gather you've been making the case that in a way cognitive bias, although I'm sure you're pretty much fine with the term, is misleading in the sense that you think that the biases begin to infiltrate the cognitive process so early that some of them are better thought of as perceptual than cognitive. Is that one thing that's distinctive about what you're doing?
Yeah, so and that the point is, if we have a strong identity, care a lot about our group, you already alluded to it, changes what we remember, what we attend to. And those types of things are particularly problematic because if people are biased and they're not aware of it, or they're selectively getting different information, you can't change their mind through reason in the same way if the biases are cognitive. If the biases are cognitive, you might be able to change their thoughts or beliefs or assumptions. But if they're just sampling the world in a different way, or you're both seeing the exact event and they're drawing a radically different conclusion, it's going to be nearly impossible to convince them. And I'll give you a real-world example of this. It's the arguments that surrounded that dress, and people weren't sure if it was black and blue or gold and yellow. And so I see it as black and blue. I can't see the gold and the white and gold. And so what ends up happening is people end up screaming at each other about what is reality, what color the dress really is. But if you're seeing a different way than me, it might be really hard to broker a compromise or convince one another. We'd probably never be able to convince one another to see it a different way, at least with that type of illusion. And if that's how we're seeing reality, man, political discourse needs to change. We need to rethink how we engage in political discourse if that's at the heart of our differences.
So it's kind of like if you're watching a sports event and there's an argument over who should have gotten called for the penalty. No amount of slow motion video is going to do the job. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So slow motion video helps us a little bit, but I was going to tell you my 3 favorite studies that tell me about human nature. My third favorite was in the 50s, and it was a study of people watching a college football game between Princeton and Dartmouth. And the newspapers for Princeton and Dartmouth reported radically different games about who was more violent and who started the violence. So professor from Princeton and Dartmouth collaborated and showed people videos of the game, and they came to very different conclusions, even when they had the video playing right in front of them.
Wait, they showed, the professors didn't, but they showed the films to the students.
Yeah.
And had them estimate the number of penalties on each side.
Yeah.
And you got the bias that you would predict. And it was, I guess, one of the first kind of quantifications of that in a real world situation. It had been a very like violent game, like Princeton's, star, left the game with a broken nose or something. I was actually looking at that paper not long ago, and it's really worth reading because there's a line where they say, they basically say I don't think I'm exaggerating much. There is no such thing as objective reality. They say
that's too far. That's crazy to me.
Do you remember them saying that? Or
yes, they did.
Yeah, they say, there's no such thing as spinach. They say, people construct reality with their assumptive form worlds or something.
Yeah, so they draw, that to me is like I had a philosopher in my lab when we all read that study, and he's like, that's a metaphysical statement that's totally unfounded, and I agree with him completely. Like, you can't draw that conclusion from that data at all.
No, but part of it must appeal to you, because your argument is that at the perceptual level, we begin slanting things, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, you've actually done some, or at least alluded to, experiments where they show that, how certain words get our attention more than other words, and so on, right?
We have studies showing that moral words, you flash, whereas you also present non-moral words. That's really quick. It's a blink of an eye. People end up saying that they can detect the moral words, whereas they're not detecting the non-moral words.
What are examples of moral words versus non-moral words?
Yeah.
What are some examples?
Some examples. So I'll give you an example. When I first did this study, we were trying to figure out how quick to present them so people kind of could see them some of the time, but not the rest of the time. And we had word we had that was moral was God, and a control word was dog. And so it's the exact same three letters, both rated very positively by people, and both words very familiar to people. And what I was sitting in the lab, I remember it was like late one night, like 8 or 9 p.m. and my student had programmed it and she wanted to go through it with me. And she presented the word, and I remember thinking I wasn't seeing any of the words. They were flashing too quickly for me to see. And all of a sudden I said, I just saw God. It was like one of those revelational moments. And it popped out, whereas the word dog, I couldn't see it. It flashed too quickly, even though it was presented the same amount of time, same letter length and all those things. And so there's a debate over whether that's perceptual or how early it happens in the brain. But we know it happens, that we now have data from EEG, so measuring electrical brain activity, and happens around 300 to 400 milliseconds after you see the word. You're treating moral words differently than non-moral words. So it's happening very, very fast. It's not happening in the retina or the V1, the earliest visual parts, but it's happening in higher order vision, that people are changing how they're seeing things.
Now we should say not all of the words you're using is moral or religious, right? It's like it seems like their words can be moral in any number of senses.
Yes. So another example word would be like just, like justice. And a control word for just would be even. So the word even kind of connotes something very similar to just, that something is just or fair. But the word just has this moral connotation about justice is a foundational moral principle. We have lots of philosophical writing about justice in that domain. But the word even really just describes some quantity. It doesn't imply anything about the morality of that quantity.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an example of a moral word and a non-moral word that are similar in length. They have similar connotations, but the word just also has this added moral meaning to it.
And the moral words jump out at us more than the non-moral words, and even at particular, there's often a threshold where if you show it for like a quarter of a second, whatever it is, like you will literally see one but not see the other.
Yeah.
And I assume, I was thinking about this. I mean, moral evaluation is one kind of evaluation. I would think that in general, things we evaluate in any sense are more likely to get our attention, right? It's like if I'm a young heterosexual male walking down the street, I'm going to notice young women. And I'm going to be evaluating, right?
Yeah.
More than I'm going to notice like old men or old women.
Yep. So what we're saying is something very similar to that morality is just piggybacking onto other systems that are used to detect important things. And morality and group identity are just some ways that we determine what's important in our world, what we should see, what we should pay attention to, what we want to interact with.
Okay. And are you encountering resistance? Are colleagues accepting the idea that moral judgment can be thought of as a perceptual and not just cognitive thing?
Well, actually, it sparked a huge debate with a group of perception researchers at Yale, and they really have this strong opinion that what's perceptual can't be impacted by what's cognitive. So our thoughts can't change what we see. And that's a huge debate in cognitive science that goes back decades. And so we're part of that debate with them. And morality is just one case where we think this happens. But we think there's lots of other studies other than ours that have shown that cognitions and our beliefs and reasoning can change our perceptions. So there's definitely a pretty hot debate in that area.
Okay. Now, I assume that some of these, we've been talking about group bias, but I assume that a lot of these, the cognitive biases that sustain group idea or group identity or sense of group entitlement can figure in at the individual level as well. In other words, I guess, what are the famous ones? Like confirmation bias. We go around looking for evidence. We notice the evidence that our group is in the right. We notice the evidence the other group is in the wrong. But that also works at the individual level. If I'm having a dispute with some individual person about the facts of the case, it's the same thing, right?
Yep, it's the same thing. So there's nothing special about bias at the group level, and in that sense that people have, if I don't like you, I might have confirmation bias if we get into some kind of argument. I might be looking for evidence that supports me and looking for evidence that disagrees with you.
Now, do you have a view on how all this stuff, well, in a way, and how deeply ingrained it is part of the question, and also what, the evolutionary origins, if any, might be?
So one of my favorite evolutionary studies on this are anthropological studies compared group bias in a bunch of primates. And what they found is that a lot of other primates will selectively engage in prosociality and cooperation with kin. Some higher order primates will even cooperate with members of their troop or a group. But what sets humans apart is our capacity for cooperating with anonymous in-group members. And so this means in-group members we've never met. So somebody who has a queue to group membership. And so you can think of this as if you go to a baseball game and you're at Yankee Stadium and you're a Yankees fan, you will befriend the person sitting next to you if they're wearing a shirt or jersey. Even though you've never met this person, they're largely anonymous to you, you'll never interact with them again, you'll be giving them high fives during the game. That's something that's distinctly human. So that's where, or certainly ants and some other species show it, but among primates, humans are different in that sense.
Wait, you said ants? High five each other at baseball games? No, not what you mean clearly. But what do you mean about their ability to? I thought ant social structure was very much kin related.
It is, but ants will cooperate and sacrifice for fellow ants that are part of their group that are very dispersed in their group that they might not have ever interacted with before. They have pheromones and ways of doing this, but ants also use symbols of group identity. Very, very primitive. And that allows them to forge a way of identifying who's with me and who's not, and a way of easily cooperating with in-group members.
Yeah, actually, come to think of it, I think I just heard a fragment of a radio lab the other day that was about this. There's apparently you can take ants, put them in touch with ants that are taken from hundreds of miles away, and they'll still go, yeah, that's one of me. Yeah. But then from 350 miles away, but in fact, but the territories are even bigger than this, I think. It's you can go, I think, maybe thousands of miles and then finally get to the borderline where those ants are the wrong kind of ants.
That sounds a lot like humans. I mean, think we could go for 1,000 miles to find other Americans that we cooperate with, and then you cross the border into Mexico or something, and you want to put a wall there. There's something different about that group. They're treated differently. So that there are some striking parallels between humans and ants that are different from the way that other primates would operate.
Mm-hmm. So are there other kinds of biases that are relevant to this that we haven't talked about? We've talked about confirmation bias. There's a whole host of kind of egocentric biases. The average person thinks that they are better at various things than the average person. They think they're more moral than the average person. Of course, some of them are right, but they can't, can't be the case that the average person is better than the average person. So there's, and so too in accepting credit for success, when your team is successful. And there are, by the way, these intra-group, tensions of perception, right? Yeah. But are there major biases we haven't talked about that?
There's a lot. I mean, there's biases that we prefer people or things that are similar to us. And so in-group members tend to be similar to us, more similar than out-group members. And that's one of the reasons we join certain groups.
Similar, you mean like visually or in terms of belief or along any of these?
In terms of belief. So who we tend to befriend and who we, search for romantic partnerships with tend to be people who are similar to us. And that could be they look similar to us, but a lot of times it's determined by our attitudes, values, beliefs. And those are some of the boundary conditions of groups. So if I have a strong Buddhist belief and you're Buddhist, then there's a greater probability that we're going to be friends. And I might look for somebody who's Buddhist for a romantic relationship. And so those end up being boundary conditions around certain groups, especially political groups.
Right. And that's kind of how it in principle starts. You would think two people find out they agree on an issue, and that's why they are part of the same tribe. But again, we seem to have gotten to a point where it's the fact of having a common enemy that becomes more significant than the actual substantive agreement.
Yeah.
So do you see any hope?
Well, let me say why I don't see hope. The first reason is every single human culture that's ever been observed forms coalitions or groups. So it's a human universal. This is part of our human nature. The other thing is there's been some studies on genetic heritage of patriotism and other types of group biases, ethnocentrism. And there's a huge amount of our variance is determined by this. That if I tend to be patriotic, I also tend to show group-based biases in other domains. And so some people are intrinsically very groupish, other people less so. And so that gives me a lack of hope. But what gives me hope is that we know from these studies, like you mentioned, the last part of that study with the kids at summer camp was that you can create common goals, common group identities, and people will rally around them. And so part of the way I think we solve this isn't just by trying to deny our groupish nature. Part of it is trying to figure out how can we leverage institutions and reward structures to harness our group nature and direct it towards things that are productive rather than destructive. Mm-hmm. I mean, easier said than done, but...
Yeah, well, of course, there are cases where you are actually put in a non-zero-sum situation. Now, a famous one, unfortunately, is actually getting attacked, whether by Al-Qaeda on 9/11 or by, whoever. Mm-hmm. But there are other kinds of non-zero-sum problems. I mean, and in fact, in that experiment, it wasn't that they were attacked by a third tribe that drove them together. It was a resource shortage. It was or the fact that they could collectively solve this lack of water problem. And you could point to non-zero-sum problems. The trouble is there's disagreement on what they are. So a classic one is global warming. Liberals would say, wait a second, we're all in this boat. The same boat, but that has now become one of the litmus tests for group identity. Whether you think that's a real threat.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. Yeah, I mean, Dan Gilbert, a psychologist at Harvard, wrote a great op-ed about global warming, and he said, and I recall this vividly, that global warming would be easier to solve if it was a sinister-looking guy with a mustache. Which is to say, if it had the form of a common enemy we could rally around, then it would be easier to solve psychologically for us, because we could use that enemy and coordinate against it, like we do in every movie where there's an alien threat. Suddenly you're working with China or Russia and cheering for them to help solve this and fight off this enemy invader. But things like global warming have additional complexities in that they're abstractions that we might not feel them as individuals. I've tried to read papers in climate science, and I have a PhD and I cannot understand them. So it's hard to anchor on facts that we can verify ourselves. And so what we're left to do is I have to defer to the consensus of 97% of scientists who say that global warming is caused by humans. And that's the best I can do, is have faith in a process of science and level of consensus that's extremely rare. I mean, I don't know anything in psychology where 97% of us agree. So that's the best we can do. And that's not a satisfying answer to a lot of people.
Yeah, and even when the enemy has an actual face, I mean, when the source of the non-zero sumness is a threat that assumes human form, like with terrorism, even that can become a source of division. So conservatives are more likely to think of the threat as Islam or Muslims, at least on kind of the far right, they might put it that simply. Whereas liberals are like, no, wait a second, virtually every Muslim in America is not a threat, okay? And if you treat them that way, then you'll get more of a threat. So they don't even agree on that. And, it's funny. Russia's an interesting case because historically, conservatives have said, the red peril, the Russians don't let, but as soon as Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, was the one being accused, suddenly liberals was the one being accused of collusion with Russians. Suddenly liberals are cold warriors. And they think Russia is like the biggest threat to national security. It almost makes you despair of solving them.
That is incredible. There's an amount of despair there. So let me say my fourth favorite psychology study of all time, and this is where I think we're at for a lot of people. Have you ever heard that book that Leon Festinger wrote about dissonance called When Prophecy Fails?
I know the phenomenon. I mean, he's the one who coined the term cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And so this is about people who make predictions that aren't fulfilled?
Yeah, so he embedded himself. He joined a cult that was a doomsday cult, was in the room when midnight, the stroke of midnight, when they said the world was going to end and the spaceship or whatever is going to come pick them up and fly away only true believers. Of course, midnight rolls around. The world doesn't end. We're here talking about it. And then it's like hours of silence in this room of everybody staring at each other, not knowing what to do. And then all of a sudden someone concludes in the cult that they were saved and they saved the world because of their strong belief. And so immediately they get on the phone and start calling the media and proselytizing. And so you think that when a belief system is invalidated, can you ever have a stronger invalidation of a belief than the world's going to end? And look, it did not at the time you predicted. If there's ever better evidence against a belief system than that, I don't know what it is. And then they ended up doubling down on their belief system is remarkable. And that tells you about group identity and belief and how resistant it is to fact. And eventually the cult faded away. Apparently there's one member left to this day. But it says there are elements of psychology like cognitive dissonance and rallying around our beliefs, because how devastating it would be for many of us to be wrong, to have to admit that, to give up on identities that we cherish. And so there are reasons to be deeply pessimistic that people are going to abandon their belief. And my data point on this that is a parallel to today is that the day before Nixon resigned, I think he still had 25% of people supported him. And that was largely Republicans. So in other words, he had the majority support among that group. And he had to resign in disgrace, a level of disgrace that was not achieved, or to my knowledge had never been achieved by any previous president. And so there are always that group of people who will hang on and support a group, a leader, a belief until the bitter end. That's disheartening.
Yeah, it's probably kind of similar because in those days, like the whole counterculture was the enemy to the hardcore Nixon supporters.
Yeah.
The people, the hippies, people demonstrating. Okay, so it sounds like nothing less than an actual, invasion from Mars.
Yeah, that's what I put my money on.
Okay. Well, of course,
Sorry.
that in various science fiction movies that has been staged in order to. There was at least an episode of the Outer Limits where they had that. So maybe that's what it'll take, and we can do that covertly.
We need a War of the Worlds. We can stage it.
Yeah. Well, the classic movie. I guess the classic movie is The Day the Earth Stood Still. In terms of planetary unification.
Yeah.
And in fact, well, anyway, I think the aliens came just to have that effect, if I recall.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't. I guess we're getting kind of far afield here. Is there anything else you want to say about actual human psychology?
I'll say this. The other thing that's interesting to me on this is social media. So we have a paper under review. I presented it last week at a conference, and we're looking now at the language and what goes viral, and what we're of moral language, moral emotions. And so if you put moral emotions in a tweet on Twitter, people are more likely to share it. But what we're finding is that they only share it within their ideological group. So conservatives will share with fellow conservatives, liberals share with fellow liberals. And it creates these echo chambers. And so, people are tuning in and sharing things that support their belief systems. And you see these little echo chambers online emerging in real time. And I think that technology is not making things better. It's not allowing us to see other opinions. What we're observing, and Wall Street Journal has a great website called Red Feed, Blue Feed. You can go on and see in real time what it looks like on debates about immigration. What would it look like from your social media feed if you were a liberal or conservative? People are getting very different information. And retreating into these little echo chambers. And so, to me, we have a really cool technology now that allows us to exacerbate these elements of human nature in ways that we haven't seen in human history. And that, to me, is also not promising as well.
Well, and the feedback you get from the social media encourages the use of emotional language. Yeah. So, like, if you just state a negative evaluation of Trump in kind of flat, emotionless terms, it'll get like 3 retweets. If you say the exact same thing, but ridicule him more explicitly, you'll get like 30 retweets. And you see the effect this is having, not just on Twitter, but on the way people write headlines. I think like the Washington Post, and it's not good. And you can
it's not good. It's not helpful, and they are obsessed with clicks, and that's what gives them advertising revenue. So and they can measure it in real time. Even I saw scientists say this with blogs about statistics. If you post a flat headline on Twitter about some statistical technique, it gets 1,000 page views. If you post an outrageous BuzzFeed style headline, it gets 10,000 page views. So even it's changing how we talk about really mundane things like science. There's like a culture for moralized language. Yeah, it's not helpful.
Yeah, no, you get real-time feedback. I remember, I was, a long time ago was at the New Republic when Mike Kinsley was editor, and then he went and started Slate. And I remember when he first started Slate, it was an online publication, and he realized that, like, you could get statistics on how many people had read individual articles, which was just radically new. Previously, the only statistical feedback you had was how much did the whole issue sell? Yeah. And the first thing he said was, I'm not sure I want to show this to writers because I don't think it would be good for them to know which of their pieces are attracting the most attention. And he foretold the decline of the American Republic at that point.
That is fantastic, and it shows that integrity to whatever the goals are of journalism has to be placed above the current contingency structures if we're going to do it well. And I would say the same thing about science. It's like, I could write a crazy headline when I'm sharing some article that I've written or someone else has. But in the long term, you erode credibility. And there's a reason why I'm reluctant to do that, is because you get a short-term benefit, but no long-term gain. It may be a long-term cost. So that is something that we all need to trade off against. And there's another cognitive bias for you, temporal discounting. Humans aren't very good at it.
Meaning we favor short-term rewards over greater long-term rewards.
Yeah. And then I'll bring this full circle. No one does that more than Trump. he's so in the moment and tweeting whatever his emotion is and whatever's going to grab attention right now, and then his campaign and supporters spend weeks covering up and trying to deal with the crisis that was caused by some tweet he sent at 3 a.m. based on whatever his state was at that moment, whatever he wanted to share.
Yeah, well, there's the classic experiment, I'm sure you're aware of, where they took little kids and said, okay, I'm going to leave you here with a marshmallow. If you eat it, it's all you get. If I come back and you haven't eaten it, you get 2 marshmallows or something like that. And then they followed these kids and they found, well, the kids who delayed gratification did better on their test scores, did better in life, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm telling you, right now we have a guy who became president, and I guarantee you he ate the 1 marshmallow.
Yeah.
I mean, so it doesn't, delaying gratification is not always conducive to success. Well, is there anything you want to tell people about where they can, do you have a Twitter feed or anything you want to?
Yeah, I have a Twitter feed. It's at JayVanBavel, and I share all my research and a lot of other research. A lot less about politics, especially, until recently, I share a bit more about politics, but mostly it's about science and sharing the current research on moral psychology, political psychology, group psychology, and neuroscience. So look forward to conversations there if anybody's interested in these topics.
And the name of your Twitter handle is it just your name?
Yeah, and also I have a lab website, and every single paper I've ever written is available for free there as a PDF. So if you're interested in the science behind these things, it's all free at one click at my website at NYU. So you can Google me, find it, and get anything you want.
Okay, so we'll link to your website in the links mentioned accompanying this on the site. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jay. And
thanks, Bob. This was fun.
Good to have that Canadian perspective on. Take care.
Thanks.